In this chapter, I'm going to show you how to use objects for debris in your explosions. And in our last tutorial in Pyrotechnics 1, we created our debris for the exploding planet by using a particle emitter and then applying hypervoxels to those particles. Well, that's really good if you're blowing up a planet, because we could use a nice rock texture for the hypervoxels. But let's say we were blowing up something mechanical, like a car, or a space station, or a spaceship, or something along those lines. We're going to want mechanical type debris. And for that, we're going to want to actually model low geometry objects to link to our particles with effects linker, which I'm going to show you once we get over to layout, and create a really nice debris object for a mechanical type explosion. So I'm going to start out by hitting create and disk. And I'm going to use the middle mouse button to pull this out so that we get a perfect circle. And then I'm going to pull it out up here, or on this back view. And then I'm going to hit N on the keyboard for our numeric options. We're going to set our sides to 6, because we don't need 24 sides. 6 will be fine. It'll give us a nice hexagonal cylinder shape, and it's perfect for a debris object. Hit spacebar on the keyboard to clear out that tool, and now we can hit A to frame that in the view. Now what we want to do is create kind of a cutting tool, and this is pretty much the same principle we did when we were breaking up our planet in the first tutorial. And what we're going to do is create a Tessellation Sphere. So we'll select ball, the ball tool under the create tab, and I'm going to use the middle mouse button to constrain again. If you don't have a middle mouse button, you can use the control key. And make it about that size, and then I'm going to hit N on the keyboard for the numeric. And we're going to change this to tessellation segments of 4. Will be just fine. We can close out that dialog, hit the space bar, and now we're going to want to move this into place. Now if you notice, this is still a very spherical looking object. It's not going to be very interesting with cut with it. It definitely won't be picking up enough highlights. So we want to jitter this, just like we did in the last tutorial. It's the same principle, and if you haven't seen the first tutorial, I'd suggest you watch it. Otherwise, you can just kind of follow along here. Alright, so I'm going to jitter it now using Shift-J, and we're going to change our type to normal. And we want to take a look at our grid spacing here, and you can see that each square is 500 millimeters. So we're going to want to jitter out our points only a little ways then. So we're going to set it to 200 millimeters. So you can type in 0.2, and that'll give you 200 millimeters. And that gives us a nice jitter on all of our points. And actually, that might be a little bit much. So we're going to undo that, go back to jitter, so Shift-J, and set it to 125 millimeters. And that looks a little bit better. It's just trying to stay away from getting strangely shaped polygons that are just too off. And so this should be good. We also want to use the magnet tool now. So Shift and the colon key, and we're going to right mouse click to pull out our area of influence, and go ahead and move some sections out here. Right mouse clicking on the crosshair and moving our area of influence by doing that. And we can clear that out, and then select the tool again and do the same thing on another axis. And we don't have to go too far with it. Alright, so now I'm going to kind of move this into place. We want to cut a little bit off the top. It'll be nice and interesting. About right there. But before we go ahead and do the cut, we want to give our object surface names so that we don't have to do it later once it's all cut up. Hit Q on the keyboard for a change surface dialog, and I'm going to name this debris cut. And then we're going to go to our first object here, and we're going to call this debris. And then we can go to our surface editor by clicking up here, or Control F3 or F5, depending on our keyboard layout, whether you're using 7.0 defaults or using 8.0 defaults, which are different. And under debris, we're going to give that like a dark gray texture, give it some specularity, turn down the glossiness. For debris cut, I'm going to do kind of a dark olive green, and we're going to up the specularity on that and reduce the glossiness. And just by having that specularity on there, it's going to make some real nice highlights as our objects are kind of flying past the camera. Alright, so we're setting our first layer 1 in the foreground and layer 2 in the background. And we're going to do a Boolean now. So Shift B on the keyboard. And what we can actually do is select intersect. And now we have a little piece right here, and we can use that as another debris object. So we don't have to get rid of that, we can just use it as another object. So we'll hit C on the keyboard to copy that, or Control C. And I'm going to undo it. And now Shift B again, and this time subtract. And now we have our cut on here. We can go to our third layer and hit paste. Control V, or just V on the keyboard. And now we have another little debris object. And we're going to go back to our first layer and work on this other debris object that we have. And what we want to do is make it a little more interesting. And also add some more places for it to pick up highlights. Because we're going to be animating this with motion blur. And we don't want all of our objects kind of are blending together, this whole object blending as it's being blurred, as it's spinning about throughout the scene. So we're going to add some extra geometry. We're going to select this bottom polygon, hit B on the keyboard for bevel, and we're just going to pull that out. I'm going to hit T on the keyboard now to move that, and then hit B again to bevel that once more. And now we got nice highlights right here on the edges, and adds a little more to the object, looks a little more interesting. But we want to make sure that we keep our polygon level low, because we don't want to tie up our scene with hundreds of thousands of polygons. Alright, now I also want to add some definition along the sides over here, but I don't want to go all the way around, because like I said, I don't want to create too many polygons. So we're just going to select 2, and since it will be spinning, we can make sure, we'll know that these will pick up some light and show up in the scene. We're also going to grab 2 of these small bottom pieces. And now I'm going to zoom in a little to the corner over here, hit B on the keyboard for bevel, and just kind of pull that out. And if you take a look now, we have some extra little highlights that are going to show up in our scene when we're rendering. And we can add something else to it. We're going to do an extrude, and we want to make sure we grab a polygon that hasn't been beveled yet. And it looks like that one hasn't. So we'll grab that and hit Shift F, and we're going to do a smooth shift with this tool. And right mouse click, T for move, and just kind of move that out a little. And that's just going to pull out our section a little bit more. And it looks like a nice little metal chunk, electrical equipment that would be blowing out. We can grab these top 2 polygons, or actually there's 4. Hit Q on the keyboard and change that to debris cut. And we're going to grab this polygon right here, hit B on the keyboard, and just bevel that to add a highlight. And there we go, our first debris object is completed. Before we move on to the next one, we're actually going to hit M on the keyboard and merge those points from our cut from before. Because if we didn't do that, then we'd have 30 extra points for each debris object, and there's going to be several hundred debris objects. So you do the math, and you'll notice that that will cut down on your processing time. Alright, we're going to go to layer 3 now, which is our intersect section that we had created before, which is just a small debris object. And we'll just grab that top polygon, B on the keyboard to create a little highlight. And then this back section, we'll hit B on the keyboard and create a highlight. And then M for merge points, and 30 points right there have also been merged. Alright, so we have our first debris object and our second, and that's what I'm going to be using for our next scene. I just wanted to give you an idea how to go about modeling some of these debris objects. Make as many as you want. The more realistic your scene's going to look. So if you have 30 or so different debris objects, the explosion will look a lot neater. I usually use about 7 or so. But right now we're just going to use 2. And I can go ahead and delete this cutting tool that we made. And actually, if you want, you can save this on a separate object. Create a new object, you can copy this and paste it in there, and then save it for future cuts if you want to be making any more debris objects or anything else you want to blow up or anything along those lines. I'm going to grab our layer 3 and I'm going to cut that and paste that into layer 2. And then hit S on the keyboard to save, and normally a dialog will pop up asking where you want to save it, but we've already saved this before we started recording, so we don't need to worry about that. Now I'm going to go over and switch to layout, and I'm not going to send it just yet because we want to set up our particles before we go ahead and start animating them. So we're going to switch to layout, and under items, we're going to select dynamic object and particle. And we want to make sure that we're using a HV emitter, because if we use particons, they can show up in the scene. And even though we're using object replacement, those particles still kind of exist within the scene, and they might render, and we don't want that. So we're going to change the name of this emitter to debris. And we also want to make sure that this is the particle, because the name of the object is also debris, so we're going to call that debris part. Hit enter, hit OK, and now we have our dialog box for the emitter. And I'm going to go ahead and close that out. Make sure the objects button down here is selected. Hit P for properties, or select the properties down here. And under the Dynamics tab, if we double click on that effects emitter, we also get that same dialog box. And that's great because it's embedded in the object properties, and I'd rather work like that, because then we can go, if we want to do a dissolve or anything like that, we don't have to switch around in different viewports or different dialogues. Alright. I'm going to change our generator size to 0.1 on all axes. So we've got 100 millimeters on each axis. And now we want to figure out how many of these objects we want in the scene. And we're going to be creating 2 of these objects. We can just clone it and then edit the second one. But right now, we're working on the first one, and we want to know how many debris objects do we want. Well, we got to keep in mind of how many debris objects we have. So depending on how many you have depends on how many different copies you want created. Since I'm only using 2, I can do quite a few. I'm going to change this to 250. And that way we're going to get 250 copies of that first object, because we're going to set the first object to this one. And we also need to look at our birth rate, because right now it's set to 100, so it's creating 100 particles per 30 frames up until 250 are created. Well, we want it to generate a lot quicker than that. We want them to all suddenly come out at once. We don't want it to slowly have them come out over a couple of seconds. And the first thing I'm going to do is change our time slider down here to 150 for the full length animation of the scene. I'm going to go to particle lifetime, change that to 150, just so we can kind of show how long it's supposed to last. And for birth rate now, we want to more than double the particle limit, and that way it'll shoot out a massive amount all at once. And I'm going to change that to 1,000. So that's generating 1,000 particles per second, but there's only 250, so therefore it'll only create those 250, and it looks like it's doing that in about 3 frames. And that should be fine. And you could even up it even more if you wanted it all generate at once. You could even use frame, which will automatically generate all those particles at once in 1 frame, but we don't want them all in 1 frame. We want them maybe 2 frames, because it's a little bit easier to work with that way. At least it is for me. So now we need to set up our motion options. We'll go back to Particle tab, and we're going to change our resistance to 0 because we don't want it slowing down. And actually, I can show you what that resistance does. If I go to Motion and set our explosion to 4, which is the actual animation, an explosion will shoot out our particles as we want them. But if you notice, there's kind of a fall off, and they really slow down at the end, and that's caused by particle resistance. So we change that to 0, And as you can see, our particles now just blast off, and they don't stop until the end of the animation. And that size should be fine right there. And we don't need to set any vibration or anything unless you want to. Just that explosion will be fine. And now, this is for space explosion, so we don't need to add any gravity or anything. But if you wanted to, go back to properties, and let's say this is a scene on Earth or on a planet where you're going to have some gravity, you can just go to etc, and for your gravity, you can type in -9.8, which is real gravity, but of course that's coming down very quickly. You could also do it the other way around, where you have an exploding upward, but we're going to cover this in a different chapter. So we're going to set this to 0 right now and do it as a space explosion, where it's just kind of shooting out into nowhere, all directions the same. Alright, so now we're going to switch to our modeler and change the size of our debris object, because right now our debris object would probably be the size of this emitter. So we'll switch over to modeler and take a look at our debris object. We're going to put them both in the same, or not in the same layer, but activate both layers right now, and just kind of take a look at the size. And I'm going to zoom in until our grid is 100 millimeters, and that's because our emitter is 100 millimeters. So if we can take into account how large our emitter is, we can take into account how big our debris is. Unless you're doing everything proportionally, then you won't have to worry about this, but we didn't model this proportionately. So we can size it down now using Shift and H, and I'm going to use the middle mouse button to constrain, although with size you don't really have to, and just make it real small. Oh, it's a little too small. And zoom in a little bit more, and make it even smaller. And then hit F2 on the keyboard, which is going to center the object. And now we can go ahead and hit S on the keyboard to save it, and then send the object into layout. And as you can see, because of that size, it changed where our camera is, which changed our grid size. So we'll go to our camera, and make sure we're at frame 0 so we're not creating any keyframes for this, and hit T on the keyboard for move. We're going to move it out. But you can see now, actually since we are so close up, you can see the relation to that box. But I'm going to change our grid size now using the right bracket key, just so we can move around a lot easier. Alright, I'm going to switch back to our perspective view, and we can zoom in here. And if I hit this little crosshair looking thing, it's going to center the viewport, or kind of target it on whatever we have selected. So I'm going to target it on our particle object, and just kind of take a look at what we have for the animation. And that looks pretty good right there. That should be fine. Now before I go ahead and use the effects linker on the object, I want to make sure I clone this so I don't have to go and create a new dynamic object and change all those settings again. So I'm going to hit Control C for clone, click OK, and just kind of move this out of the way right now, which is part 1 and part 2. And the reason I just did part before and didn't give it a name or a number is because once we clone it, it'll give us our number. So we have part 1 selected right now, and now we're going to go to the Utilities tab, under Additional, select FX Linker. And the particle that we want to use is part 1, and the debris object we want to use is layer 1, which is that first debris object. Now we want to set up some rotation, so we're going to set our rotation to random. We don't need to mess with any of these other settings except down here, which is our random rotation, minimum and maximum for each axis. Now, we're going to want this kind of high, because if you're thinking about it, these are small objects that are exploding, and they'd be shooting out of there pretty quick and rotating all over the place. So I'm going to set our minimum to 900, and I'm going to set our maximum to 3000. And I also want to change our copy Now we know we have 250 particles that are being created. So we have one object already. So we only need to create 249 copies, and that way there will be a total of 250. Click OK, and now it's going to process all that information. And if we go over here, and if you notice, it actually didn't. Oh, here we go. It's because we have our debris objects actually a little small. So actually what I can do is go back into Modeler and size those back up, and then hit save and switch back to layout, and now we have the correct size. And that's one of the nice things about FX Linker, is you can still change the size, and it'll go ahead and copy that. And if you take a look, we've actually have all of these objects in here, 250 of that first debris object, and that can get that's a lot of clutter. So if you're creating debris objects for your explosions, I would definitely recommend doing them last. Set up the rest of your scene first, and then your debris object you want to set up last, just because you don't want that many objects in the scene when you're trying to work with something like an explosion or any animation whatsoever. So just make sure you set up your debris objects last. At least that's what I would suggest, and it's usually a good idea. Alright, so now we're going to set up our second debris object. So we're going to grab debris part 2, and I'm going to go to modify and reset under move, and that's going to bring us back to our center point, making sure that we're on frame 0 so that we don't create a key for it. And I'm going to open up the object properties, so Shift O and then P, and double click under FX Emitter under the Dynamics tab. And we want this to be different than our other one. These are smaller. This is going to be a smaller object, this other debris object, so we can create more of them. We'll create, let's say, 500. And we want these to shoot out even quicker, since we have twice as many. Let's change our birth rate to twice as much. So let's set that to, not 20,000, but 2,000. So that's going to create 2,000 particles per second. And as you can see, we have our particles in here. Alright. Motion, we can keep that all pretty much the same because it's part of the same explosion, therefore the pieces would be traveling about the same. Of course, these are the smaller pieces, so if you wanted to, you could change your explosion to, let's say, 4.5, and that way they shoot out a lot faster and a lot quicker because, well, they're smaller objects. So you can really take that into account if you wanted to, depending on the size of your object, and that's why it's nice too to have separate emitters for each debris object, as you can take that into account if you really want to. Everything looks fine right there, so now we can open up our FX linker again. So under the Utilities tab, select Additional FX Linker, and now we have Particles Debris 2 selected, and we're going to replace that object with Debris 001 Layer 2. Rotation, we're going to set to random. Copy, we can, since we have 500, we'll set it to 499. And we're going to rotate these a lot more. We're actually going to set this to 12,000. And then 12,000. 12,000 again. And that's just for our maximum. And now our minimum, we'll set that to 3,000. And that's just so we get a lot of variation in there. We can get some very fast pieces and some slower pieces. And click OK. And now it's processing that. And now I have one of the individual objects selected, which is our original object. I can go all the way up through these objects and select part 1. And if you take a look here, you can see our small debris object, which is right here. And we have, you can see there's only a little bit of rotation on that one, and some of them are rotating a little quicker. But we get nice depth in there with having different size objects, and it looks pretty neat. And as you can see, this one's flying into the camera, which is good that we have a little bit of definition on it, but we can go ahead and move the camera. So select the camera, hit T to move, make sure we're on frame 0, so you're not creating any keys, and then move that into place. Now if you notice too, we have this kind of ball, this ball of particles and debris objects, and if you really want, you could change your emitter size even lower. But what I would just really suggest doing is kind of hiding this whole set of objects inside of your explosion, and that way you won't see it up until the point of the explosion. Because going ahead and dissolving each individual debris object up until the point of the explosion is going to take you a ridiculous amount of time, and it's just kind of, it's not a good idea. Alright, so now I'm going to kind of show you what it's going to look like with motion blur on. So we're going to open up our camera properties, and motion blur depends on anti-aliasing. If you don't have anti-aliasing on, you can't have motion blur. And depending on how many passes you have, depends on the quality of the motion blur and really how much motion blur there is overall. 2-pass motion blur is not going to look very good, but if we set it up to maybe 5 or 7 pass, 5 pass should be fine. We can change our motion blur to normal and set our blur length to, say, 35. So now we'll go to our render tab, select render frame, or hit F9 on the keyboard, and we can render that out. And as you can see, that's a real subtle motion blur. We can increase that if we want to, let's say, 65 and see how that looks. That might be a bit much, but we'll take a look. And you can kind of tell in the preview too, because you can see all of the debris objects shifting and changing. And that looks like it's a pretty good motion blur. So we have, even with our motion blur, we can still pick up all our little highlights here and there. Even if they're only 1 pixel highlights, it's better than having nothing. And of course we didn't texture this, but if we were, it would of course look a lot more real. There's another thing I want to mention too. In the last tutorial we used hypervoxels for our debris objects, but because of hypervoxels, it takes a very long time to render each frame. So one thing you want to keep in mind, either way, whether you're creating rocks for debris or you're creating this mechanical looking stuff, and for the mechanical looking stuff you won't really be able to use hypervoxels, but let's say you created a rock object and you could use that as a debris object. Well, when you're using hypervoxels, the only way to get motion blur out of it is if you have volumetric anti-aliasing on, and that can take a very long time. And the way to access that is you Control F5 and then click on the Volumetrics tab, or just Control F6 and that'll take you straight to this tab. You can turn it on and off. Well, we had turned it off in our previous tutorial just because it will render a heck of a lot quicker that way, so you don't have to do the passes, but we didn't get our motion blur because of it. So one thing to keep in mind is how long you're going to be rendering, how long you plan on rendering, and how much motion blur you want, or if you even want motion blur. So that's pretty much it. Of course we could, like I said, go in and add different types of debris objects in here and really change it up, make it look real interesting.